If you're a newer music producer struggling to come up with melodies, this video is definitely going to help you out. What's up, my producer friends? It's David with anothermonsterproductions.com. Before we get into the tutorial, there's just a couple things that I want to mention. First of all, I'm going to include some MIDI and audio chord progressions, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the tutorial, why I think these will be helpful for you. And then I'm also going to include this text document, which is just 9 things to keep in mind while you're writing your own melodies, and this checklist will kind of help you out in the future. So that's all going to be in a zip file, which I'll include in the description of this video. Go ahead and download that. That should help you out quite a bit. Now, this video has actually been probably the most requested video since I started the channel, and part of the reason it's taken me so long to do it is just because there's so many variables involved in where you personally might be as a music producer, and everyone might have a slightly different thing that they're struggling with when it comes to melodies. And so I'm going to do my best to address all the issues that you guys might be having when it comes to coming up with melodies. But keep in mind that this tutorial in particular is geared more towards beginners who are brand new to FL Studio or to music production, who are just really struggling with even coming up with melodies to begin with. So hopefully this video answers all your questions. If you're more advanced, maybe you have a technique of your own that you want to share with people in the comments down below, feel free to go ahead and do that. One thing that I would recommend is that you learn at least a little bit of basic theory knowledge. I've actually got a couple of music theory videos on this channel, which should get you caught up to the point where you can, follow along easily with this video and know enough about music theory that you should be able to come up with melodies on your own. And I'll be sure to leave links in the description of this video for those videos as well. And without further ado, let's get straight into it. All right, so first things first, I'm going to go into my piano roll within FL Studio. If you're using a different DAW, the tip that I'm about to show you, I'm 99% sure will be available in any DAW you're using. But in FL Studio, what I'm going to show you how to do is turn on helpers so that you know that you're staying in the right key and that you're playing the right scale when coming up with your melodies. For beginners, I think this is an important step because it's going to eliminate all the other possible notes that you might be fumbling around with and trying to figure out whether or not they work with the melody that you're coming up with. So this is the simple fix. So let's go ahead and click this button here, go down to where it says helpers, and we're going to go to scale highlighting. Chances are by default you'll have black notes highlighted. Don't know why that's the default. It was for me at least. But we have all these other options down here, which are different scales that we can choose from. And so this may seem a little bit overwhelming because there are so many different options. Don't worry about all these other options. I know that there's like this information floating around on the internet that there are like certain modes or certain scales that are going to like unlock the perfect melodies or something like that. Don't worry about all that stuff for now. To be honest with you, most popular music that you hear, trap beats, lo-fi, EDM, R&B, pop, so many different genres, the main scale that you're going to be using is the minor scale. And there are actually 3 different types of minor scales. In one of my music theory videos, I talk all about this. Like I said, I'll be sure to leave a link in the description of this video if you guys want to check that out. But for us, the main minor scale, like the most common one, is the natural minor scale. It's this one here. It says minor natural Aeolian, and Aeolian is a mode. I get into that in that music theory video, but basically Aeolian is the same as the natural minor scale. So that's what we want to choose right there, natural minor. And then you'll notice these light areas changed. And the next thing that we want to do is pick a key so that we can stick to a certain key and come up with our melody within that. Right now, by default, it's set to C. That's why you see the C is grayed on the different octaves. And a good rule of thumb, one thing that I personally like to do when coming up with a key is I'll find like a really nice sounding 808 or sub bass that I want to use within the track. And then I'll find the note that sounds the biggest, best, fullest, loudest, whatever. And I'll use that note to determine the key. So whatever note I'm playing is going to be the key that I want the rest of the song to be in. So I already know, because I've been producing for so long, that there are certain keys that kind of work with bass music, with hip hop. And one of them is F, E, E or F are good ones around that area, even down to D sometimes. But for the sake of this tutorial, let's just go ahead and go back into our helpers, go to scale highlighting, and we're going to put this in F. So now you can see we're in F. And basically all the lighter areas on the piano roll are going to be the notes that are in the scale of F minor. All right, so let me go ahead and plot this out on the piano roll just so you can kind of hear what the scale actually sounds like. right, so this is our F minor scale, natural minor to be more specific, and these are all the different notes that you can potentially use within your melodies that you want to come up with when you're in the key of F. And one thing that some people like to do is they'll come up with ghost notes. But what you want to do is highlight all these and then drag them out as far as you want. Probably right about there is good. And then we would exit out of this and essentially load up a new instrument. We can mute this one and then go back into our piano roll. And now we have these notes highlighted, but nothing's actually playing. So it's just kind of an easier way of seeing what notes are going to be in that scale that we can actually use. And just a quick tip, another note that can often work, which is another variation of our minor scale, is this note here. So we have this note and we have this note as well. So if you want to do the ghost note thing, that's another potential note that you could include in there. And that's going to be our E, or the note right below our F. So just something to keep in mind for your melodies. Now, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. I want to keep things fairly simple and not overwhelm you with information, but I know people are going to probably say something about it if I don't mention it. And that is, of course, there are other popular pieces of music that are in different keys and maybe in like a major key, or maybe switch between major to minor, or use various other modulations so that it's not necessarily in the same key the whole time. But for the sake of this tutorial, try not to worry about all that stuff for now. That's going to come later on once you get comfortable with just creating basic melodies. All right, so what I want to do next is take a look at some of these chord loops that I've come up with. And one strategy that I would recommend that you use is basically using chord progressions to come up with melodies around that chord progression. So this is going to help you sort of feel a certain vibe that's already in place with the chord progression, and then you can come up with those melodies around that. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the chords that I included in the MIDI pack. If you have like certain songs that you really like, I'd actually suggest you do this anyway. Maybe find the chord progression that they're using in that particular song, plot that chord progression out, figure it out, and then come up with your own melodies from that chord progression. And another thing that I just want to kind of mention is that if you're interested in producing, hip hop, a lot of hip hop these days is very melody driven anyway, when it comes to like the actual lyrics and the vocals. So a lot of times with these types of beats, you're really only coming up with a chord progression anyway. And if there is a melody, it's going to be super simple, very like low down, because you don't want to take away from the melody that the singer, vocalist, rapper is coming up with. So just another thing to kind of keep in mind. All right, so let's go ahead and load up one of these chord progressions. All right, so these are all in F minor, so you can easily follow along. This first one is just a very simple 2-chord chord progression, kind of like a trappy vibe going on with it. So let's go ahead and drag this in, and I'll just turn this down just a bit. And then it looks like we're at 155 BPM. So these are all labeled with the BPM, make it easy on you. And if you want to do MIDI and that way you can choose your own instruments, you can do that as well. All right, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and use this pattern to come up with our melody. And then I can just loop this here. All right, so a couple things to keep in mind here while we're coming up with our melodies. As you can see with our ghost notes, we're really only doing one octave. From the F to the other F, that's an octave. And generally speaking, when you're coming up with melodies, we want to try and keep things pretty simple. We want to try and not go from, let's say, one note way down here all the way up to like here or something like that. Generally speaking, you want to keep it within the same octave to an octave and a half maybe. And try not to do too many like crazy intervals either. Try and keep the notes a little bit closer together. And that should hopefully help you come up with catchier melodies that are going to kind of allow the listener to want to sing along to. So let's go ahead and come up with something. All right, so there we go. That's a very simple, catchy melody. Another sort of trick that you can keep in mind is that I'm using different spacings in between these notes. So this is another thing to keep in mind to help you create more interesting melodies. For example, I could have gone in here and like evenly spaced all these notes and just kind of had it been like this. Which, I mean, still sounds kind of cool, but when I take out all these extra notes, it just allows for a melody that kind of sticks more in your head and makes you want to hum along to it, and you like immediately latch onto it, and then it's just going to repeat over and over again. And another thing to keep in mind, if you are going to create a different melody for the verse and for the chorus or hook or whatever, sometimes like a nice tip that you can use to have the melody be in like a higher octave or just higher up in the above the notes. It's just going to be a little bit more impactful, kind of add a little bit of variation. So let's move on to another example here. This one's at 85 BPM, and I'll just make it that long. Let's go back in here. And you don't have to start on the root note. I know I did with that last one. The root note is just simply the first note in the scale. So in this case, it would be F. So let's try starting somewhere else. So again, I'm just plotting random notes here, trying to find what kind of works, keeping in mind that different amounts of spacing is going to sort of make this melody more interesting and catchier and add a little bit of flavor to it. Let's do one more example. I feel like I'm coming up with the same melody as I did on the last one. Let me try something different. Another thing that might help you out is to just play the notes that kind of go along with the chord progression and maybe fill in some gaps from there. So there's a possibility there. I mean, the thing really is, once you get a chord progression and then you can come up with a melody from there, the possibilities are really pretty limitless as far as what you can come up with, and just play around with it until you find something that sounds simple but catchy, and that, you know, the more you listen to it, the more it just really makes you want to like sing along with it and get stuck in your head. Once a melody gets stuck in your head, then you definitely know you're on the right track to a catchy melody. So just a quick recap here. I'll kind of go over what I have going on here with these melodies. So this is going to be the text document that I include along with the MIDI and chords. But just a quick recap. Number one, keep it simple and short. I mentioned that. Make sure your melodies are in the proper key and scale. Use helpers if you need to. We went through that. Use chords first and come up with the melody based on the chord progression. We did that. Make sure to use different length spaces or silences. They're called rests in music theory, between the notes in your melodies to keep it more interesting and catchy. Definitely talked about that. That's a really important one in my opinion. Use different length notes to make your melodies more interesting. This is sort of the same thing as step 4. It's just kind of using notes instead of spaces. We didn't really do that in this tutorial, but it's something that I urge you to experiment with when coming up with your own melodies. Try to keep your melodies in the same octave for the most part. We talked about that. That's not necessarily a rule. It's just kind of a guideline to help you out while you're doing this. And I mean, that goes for all this stuff. None of these are rules. These are just sort of guidelines that are hopefully going to help you out while you're creating your melodies. And even if they were rules, when it comes to music, rules were made to be broken. So I urge you to get creative, you know, think outside the box, find a cool way to break some of these rules if you can. Think of your melodies as a call and response, works in some cases. I didn't really mention this in the tutorial. I'll kind of go over that real quick. So one thing that can help you potentially when you're coming up with your melodies is to break the first section and the second section into different sections of your melody. So the first section is going to be the call, the second section is going to be the response. And it's just another way to just sort of think about your melodies. So I'm actually going to go into a little bit of bonus information here with this idea. One thing that you can sort of use to determine the contour of your melodies, which is the arc, the story that it tells kind of. So some melodies are going to go up and then come back down. Some are going to start up, come down, go back up. But one thing to keep in mind with this call and response thing, and just sort of a guideline, I guess, that you can think of, is the call will ask a question, the response will answer it. A good way to ask a question with a melody is to have the melody come up and need to be resolved, and then the second half it'll come back down, and that will answer the question. It will resolve the melody. So just another tip that you can kind of think about and use. And then the last one here is chorus or hook melodies can be more effective if they are higher in pitch than your verses. I kind of touched on that, but I don't want this tutorial to go on forever, so I hope that it was helpful for you. If you liked it, please go ahead, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I do a lot of FL Studio related tutorials and production tutorials in general, and I do have a lot of sound design tutorials specifically on the channel as well. So if you're into any of that stuff, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification if you want to be notified anytime I release videos in the future, and I will see you in the next video.